Order, order. Good afternoon and welcome to the Women and Equalities Select Committee. Today we're holding an oral evidence session on misogyny, the manosphere and online content. And I am really delighted that we've got an expert panel before us. Thank you and welcome for joining us. We'll be hearing from Dr. Lisa Sugiura, Assistant Professor in Cybercrime and Gender Criminology at the University of Portsmouth, Dr. Kaitlyn Regehr, for the Assistant Professor in Digital Humanities at the University College London, Jacob Davey, he's the Director of Policy and Research for Counter Hate Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and Janaya Walker, Head of Public Affairs at End Violence Against Women Coalition. Thank you for coming again and welcome. I'm going to hand over to Christine.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Apologies, first of all, if I mispronounce the names. I'm having terrible trouble at the moment, so I can sympathise. Dr. Sugiura, if I could ask, first of all, could you give us an overview of the different manosphere communities out there, the sort of similarities and the differences?
Okay, so just to provide some background context, so the manosphere is a digital ecosystem that has largely grown over the sort of last 10 to 15 years, and it is the contemporary offshoot of pre-existing men's rights groups, particularly the men's rights movement that sort of came to fruition in the 1970s, and it's really the sort of digital contemporary version now where content on issues that aren't just predominantly men's issues, but have been kind of co-opted, sort of discussed in forums and blogs, and it can involve sort of fitness, relationships, very traditional gender roles, and there's this overriding sense that feminism has ruined their lives, but more than that, it's corrupted society, and now men have to sort of fight back for their very survival. And that's a sort of overarching kind of ideology that sort of draws together all the groups then that are within the manosphere. But the key groups, I mean, there's quite a few, but the sort of main groups that coalesce within these spaces are the men's rights activists, and they're a movement that I think are the most aligned with the men's rights movement, and they feel that men are discriminated in society. Then we have MGTOW, which is short for Men Going Their Own Way. They're an online community and also an ideology made up of men who advocate for disengaging from relationships with women and often from broader societal expectations altogether. They're often, but they're not always, divorced men who are angry at women, such they decide to avoid sexual and romantic relationships altogether. Then we have pickup artists, or PUAs for short. They're part of the seduction industry, and they teach men manipulative techniques to pick up women, essentially. And then the sort of last key group are incel, short for involuntary celibates, and they believe that due to genetic traits, so circumstances that are beyond their control, that they are unable to attain romantic and sexual relationships with the women that they desire and that they believe that they're entitled to.
Thank you. That's quite a worrying picture, but how would you say that this manosphere has gained traction now with men and boys? Is it through issues, or what would you say?
I think so. There's kind of different aspects that have led to the growth. I mean, not least obviously the growth of the internet, providing a space for like-minded individuals to come together with very little oversight or accountability or challenge to hateful discourse. But there's also offline things that we need to consider, the socio-political climate, and a failure then to tackle misogyny and violence against women and girls and hold perpetrators accountable, even gender progression. And I don't mean that in a way that gender progression is bad, but that there's always a backlash when there is progression from the groups that feel that they are then somehow being discriminated against and that their rights are somehow being challenged. And then lastly, it is issues. It is genuine issues that men and boys are experiencing, that they somehow feel that they're left behind. I said these issues are not necessarily unique to men and boys: mental health issues, isolation, loneliness, struggling financially and economically. But it's almost as if there's not been a space offline for them to have these discussions, and then these opportunities have arisen online, and it's easy to other women and feminism and gender progression and equality as the problem for these feelings that they're experiencing.
How do you think it'll evolve? Where do you see it going from here?
Well, I mean, if we just continue to let it grow as we have done, I mean, it's going to keep continuing. It's going to keep spreading these ideologies and indoctrinating young men and boys. I think we need to be cognizant of emerging and future technologies as well. So these groups are not just talking in hateful ways about women and marginalised persons. They're actively engaging in violence. So I know a lot of attention has been afforded to offline physical mass attacks, but every day these groups are engaging in networked harassment, doxing, which is the release of personal identifiable information, image-based abuse, stalking, and so the next sort of logical step for these groups is that they're going to be engaging in more forms of emerging tech and AI, Gen AI, things like deep fake technology, engaging in harassment and abuse and virtual sexual assaults in the metaverse and other forms of virtual worlds and extended reality technologies.
Jacob, if I could ask you, thank you very much for that, but Jacob, if I could ask you, how many men in the UK do you think are part of this, and how would we go about measuring that?
So I think that's the million-dollar question. It's quite challenging to say for certain and give a comprehensive overview, and there are different ways of measuring this. So on the one hand, you can look at the audiences which some of the more high-profile influencers have. So we know that some of these influencers who are adjacent to the manosphere, I think Andrew Tate would be the most prominent example here, can regularly reach an audience of millions. You can also do counts of active members of forums. So you could look at an incel forum and sort of count the numbers there, typically in the thousands. But I think that where I would approach this from is actually on their audiences and the impact they have. Because when we talk about the manosphere, we can talk about these communities online, these disparate communities who are in their own way promoting some form of ideological misogyny, or you can talk about their reach. And I think that this is where there are some quite interesting statistics. So Movember, for example, have just published some research which points towards the fact that 60% of boys and men are consuming material from what they call masculinity influencers. Now, there is, I think, some significant overlap there with the manosphere more broadly. There's also polling which was commissioned by Hope Not Hate, which found that 80% of 16 and 17-year-old boys had consumed content created by Andrew Tate. Or a poll by Internet Matters, which found that 56% of young fathers under the age of 35 approved of Andrew Tate. And so I think that this is the angle where I would go at when we're actually thinking about the size, the impact of these communities is actually in their reach. The number of young men and boys who they're reaching, the number of young men and boys who they're actively selling a misogynistic worldview to. Thank
you very much. Dr. Regehr, if I could ask you, how many people do you think are exposed to the manosphere content, even if they aren't looking for it? Some may be, but it may just be algorithms are pointing a lot of people in that direction.
Yeah, so I would say that the nature of this community has shifted substantially in the last decade. So when I first started working on the involuntary celibate community, or what is known as incel, with Detective Inspector David Tan with the Metropolitan Police, we were looking at a relatively niche community of young people who were operating on fairly alternative platforms like 4chan and 8chan. And these individuals were taking on language of the oppressed, and they typically focused on women as the source of their unhappiness. And in a survey carried out by members of the community in 2029, all of the 667 respondents were male, 64% were between the ages of 18 and 24, Among the respondents, 70% suggested they had been bullied in childhood, 94% said that they had missed out on developmental milestones, and with respect to mental health, 74 identified as having experienced anxiety and stress, and 76% indicated they had seriously committed suicide. Okay? Now, during lockdown, we saw some of the main indicators for engagement within the incel community become more intensified through social isolation and high dosages of online consumption, but we also saw something else. We saw TikTok emerge as the dominant youth platform, and during this period, we saw content that was once relegated to rather alternative platforms like 4chan move on to mainstream youth platforms like TikTok and become saturated and normalized across a much wider population of young people. And with this, we began to see widespread uses of incel rhetoric in schools. I've even had the heads of boys' schools call me to say, I have an entire year 10 group who's gone incel. And this is a very different phenomenon than what we were dealing with at the Met pre-COVID. So if Incel 1.0 was about social isolation and feeling left out, Incel 2.0, by contrast, is about banding together and finding empowerment through the language of incel in a way that's saturating a much broader youth culture.
Thank you. I actually noticed, Ms. Walker, you were nodding there as if that reflects your own experience. I mean, to what degree do you think that the talking points and what we're hearing are now in the mainstream, they're trickling into it?
Thank you. So just to give some introduction, I'm here from the End Violence Against Women Coalition. We are a registered charity comprised of 160 primarily frontline specialist violence against women and girls services, but also other NGOs, researchers, academics. And part of the work that we do is we convene a prevention forum which brings together experts who are kind of delivering frontline work within schools. And I think it's been really welcome to hear my fellow panellists talk about this issue in the sense that perceiving it as a continuum of violence against women and girls. So thinking about the fact that there are quite extreme manifestations of some of these ideas and ideologies within, for example, incel communities, but also that the real concern here, and I think to answer your question, we are really concerned about that seepage into the mainstream and the extent to which some of these regressive ideas have been repackaged and are being repurposed to a really broad audience and are being normalised. And when we think about the efforts of the government to halve violence against women and girls, I think the focus of this inquiry is really important in that it takes us towards what are some of the drivers, what are some of the social attitudes and behaviours which underpin violence against women and girls. And I think the normalisation of what may have previously been regarded as fringe views or extreme views is a really concerning trajectory.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. Kind of following on from that point, Janaya, around how this is trickling down to the mainstream, I'm going to read out some of the evidence that our committee has received, name withheld, obviously. You've set up an equality committee exclusively for women, where you focus solely on solving women's problems and criminalise young men while you earn millions. It's disgusting how privileged and discriminatory you are. This has to stop. I'd like to clarify that we've just done some work on shared parental leave and just heard a lot about fathers' rights to parental leave. How is it possible that you're only interested in men's well-being when it's only for the benefit of women? Because more and more men hate you because they realise that many of you women are human garbage. How do we believe you're truly looking out for our well-being when your organisation only has the word women in its name, not the word men? When you start releasing thousands of studies paid for with our money in which you only care about women's problems while celebrating men's. When I've never seen you mention the word misandry in almost 20 years, in fact you've promoted it, dehumanising men and calling us rapists, toxic people, and scum who do not deserve equal rights in our own native country, the only one we have. Your discriminatory and sexist committee is nothing more than a fucking scam where you only hire and promote women while spreading hatred against us. This must change. There must be an all-male committee, there have been plenty of those, I'd like to add, dedicated to solving men's problems. You can't be trusted. I know you hate us and are only after your own privilege and benefit. I hope you pay for all the harm you British prostitutes have done. I also prefer the word sex workers. So, Sorry, Christine. When I say that that's not unusual for what I would receive in terms of content, it is kind of unusual that we would receive something like that as written evidence. We have yet to decide whether that written evidence will be agreed by the committee. I personally think it should, because it's a very good example as to why we are holding this committee session.
Absolutely.
I think it will also be flagged to security as well. But when we talk about it becoming part of the mainstream, my worry isn't necessarily the reach. My worry is how accepted this has become. Is there any way of challenging that at the moment in a way that you feel has been successful, Janaya?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think reading it or hearing it in such plain terms, I think really speaks to some of the sentiment that the panel has discussed in terms of that perception that women's rights are at the expense of men's sort of flourishing within society and creating this kind of zero-sum game whereby if there is sort of more progressive policies for some, then that means that others lose out. But yeah, I think it really articulates so many of those points almost in a textbook form, but that doesn't take away from the kind of gravity of it. And I think it also speaks to what lots of women in public life then experience when they put themselves forward to talk about these issues. So I think that's really important to name as well. I think to go to your question around its normalisation, yes, I think that's a really crucial point. I think it's about its reach. I think it's about normalisation. I think it's about the extent to which these ideas about women and girls are regarded as acceptable, because I think that permissibility is what can also shape the way that people treat each other, of course. So it seems like an obvious point. In terms of what we're seeing to challenge that behaviour, I think that's a really good question. That points us to what is it that works. And I think sometimes there is a desire that when we get into these conversations, there might be this amazing new radical thing that we've never heard of, but oftentimes we've been talking about this issue for a very long time. It's taking us back to some of the core principles around prevention. What's happening in schools and education is a really important site to think about. We've had mandatory RSE, or relationships and sex education, since 2020. We know that that is making some progress. There's research to say that year on year, young people are talking about the extent to which they feel equipped to have these conversations, but it is nowhere near as far as we could go and as ambitious as we should be, given the scale of the problem, to really embed this not only within schools and education, but also in our public comms and our behaviour campaigns across government departments. I think this was borne out. Everyone will be aware, there was the report by the National Audit Office around, the previous government's record on tackling violence against women and girls, and the evidence was really clear that prevention has really been an afterthought. It has not got the same political attention or investment or commitment than other issues have. And I think when we're talking about how do we challenge this, we really need to go much further. We obviously have now the Safer Streets mission and the government's ambition, which we really welcome, to halve violence against women and girls within a decade. But we need to see that getting started. I think it was just on Friday the Public Accounts Committee published its report with some concerns that the Home Office nor the DfE were able to give a start. When are we getting started? Because so many of these conversations that have been born out from adolescence and so on, we tend to return back to, well, we've got to look at the Department of Education. But when we go to the Department of Education, our members and ourselves are saying, so where are we? We're really keen to get into this work and to build on the brilliant work that's already been done, but just to do it at a much bigger scale and with much more investment than we've seen to date.
Thank you, Janaya. I think that leads us on really nicely to Catherine's questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you've answered this to some degree, Janaya, but could you build on what you've already said and what Dr. Lisa said earlier, which is how the manosphere content leads on, and indeed if it does, in your opinion, lead on to violence against women? How does it amplify?
Yes. So our sort of ethos or values as an organisation is to say, the evidence tells us that violence against women and girls is not preventable. It is, that's a very PJ. Violence against women and girls is preventable, but is not inevitable. But if we are going to prevent violence against women and girls, we need to think about what are the sort of social attitudes and behaviours which underpin it. So some of these ideas around men's entitlement to women's bodies, the idea that women owe men affection or attention, the idea that women are of lesser value if they engage in sexual activity, all of these kind of ideas which have a very long history in terms of traditional gender roles, but also which are really about the domination of women and patriarchy. The question about how we're going to address these, we're contending really, I think, with what we're saying on the panel, with the fact that there is now the internet, which has a really huge countervailing force against our efforts to try and move us towards a more just world for women and girls. I think, as others have alluded to, we've had the Me Too movement. There's been some real sort of outpouring from feminists, from women and girls talking about their experiences, but I don't think we've had alongside that the opportunity to have really constructive dialogue about how we move us towards a society which is invested in and which men and boys feel invested in creating a world which is also better for them.
So in terms of the link, how can we break that link then, that link between the manosphere and content that boys and men are seeing, and then what makes them then go on to commit an act? Because obviously not every young boy who sees content will go on and do something. So what is it that's making them maybe, and how to break that link? I don't know if anyone else wants to comment either.
Yeah, if just to add one more point, other than looking at the role of schools and education, one of the other areas we seek to highlight is about the role in which the platforms themselves, so the social media platforms, play a role in the way that they promote this content. So I'm sure the committee would have considered already the role of algorithms and recommender systems, and the way in which the business model itself is set up in a way which can facilitate and sort of redistribute these ideas to a much wider audience. So if we're thinking about how to intervene, one of these is going to be to think about what the role of the government is and Ofcom is to introduce safety by design, to really embed anti-gender-based violence within its policies.
And just to finish on that point, do you feel that then that needs to be included in the strategy for halving violence against women?
Absolutely, yeah. We'd really hope to see a central role for DSIT in the bulk strategy.
Go for it, Jacob.
I mean, if I could also come in on this, I think that there is a role to be had in connecting the dots between different strategies and different approaches as well. So last year, the Home Secretary announced that extremist misogyny would be considered as an ideology in and of itself under counter-extremism strategy. That appears to have stalled, but I think that as that comes to fruition, it's going to be really essential to understand that role and that apparatus in terms of countering extremism as one, not the be-all and end-all, but as one part of a solution for countering this. So if we're thinking about young people who are most likely to go out and commit violence, then they may well be caught in the prevent strategy in mechanisms which are sort of set up to help counter and de-radicalise people. And I think that as we're thinking more broadly about countering violence against women and girls, making sure that that is connected into counter-extremism efforts is going to be important. And I think that there is some really interesting research out there. So Bettina Rottweiler and Paul Gill from UCL have done some great work which points towards misogynistic attitudes acting as a predictor for an increased likelihood of people wanting to engage both with extremism and in interpersonal violence. And when we think about misogynistic attitudes writ large, they are a common feature in extremist movements which we'll be familiar with, so with white supremacists, the extreme right wing, and also with Islamist movements as well. So if we're thinking about catching people who are right at the sharp tip, potentially going to go out and engage in targeted violence or mass casualty violence, then I think that connecting the dots there is important.
And Dr. Kaitlyn or Dr. Lisa, do you want to make a comment about what kind of behaviour or harm towards women does the manosphere encourage?
I think I'd like to sort of follow on as well from the previous discussion, but we'll link in with the question that you just asked. I mean, there's evidence to show that perpetrators of extremist violence have had a history of violence against women previously. Many of these perpetrators have engaged in domestic abuse, if not against partners, against family members, predominantly female family members, often their mothers as well. So we can already see that sort of continuum of violence. But in terms of the sort of harms, as I've already mentioned, it's the everyday harms that they're engaging online, where they're engaging in forms of online violence against women and girls, the doxing, the abuse, the networked harassment. So the manosphere was engaged in quite notorious forms of harassment like Gamergate, the image-based abuse of celebrities in America following the iCloud hack, as well as the Thought Audit campaign as well, where they targeted sex workers and leaked their details to the IRS in America. They target women in the public eye, obviously, because they have a problem with women in powerful positions. But I also think we need to be aware of the risks of future perpetrators as well. This is something that is not often spoken about. So in my research with incels, I spent 3 years in the manosphere and I interviewed self-identified current and former incels. So those that said that they were former incels, that they'd so-called ascended, they still showed misogynistic tendencies. So they can reject the incel label, they might not necessarily engage in those spaces, but they will still talk about women in pretty dehumanizing terms, which, as we know, is a predictor for gender-based violence. And often the reason that these men were saying that they were ex-incels is because they'd found themselves a girlfriend, which is very much obviously what they wanted in the first place. But of course, they still held as really negative attitudes. So I think what we're not discussing as well is the risks to current and former partners of men in the manosphere, or who may claim to have left behind those ideologies.
Thank you, Catherine. Dr. Lisa, why is it that you think that, from your research, that the manosphere influencers have built up such a large following? And also, just to follow on from one of our previous panels of people that work with young people every single day, they talked about actually it's only losers that really follow Andrew Tate in schools, that actually it's more the middle level influencers which young people are really kind of sharing, taking note of. And what's the kind of draw to that mid-level rather than the larger reaching audiences that, say, some of the other influencers that we've already mentioned reach?
So some of the bigger names, maybe they're more overt in their forms of misogyny or hatred towards women, where you've got, say, the more middle tier misogynistic influencers, so to speak. Maybe what they're saying and doing is more palatable as well. They're providing a space for young men and boys where those young men and boys feel that they're disenfranchised. Usually they don't actually have role models to look up to. They're saying that all of their problems are external to them as well, which is quite seductive. And also, often the content is presented in an educational, scientific way as well. So there's a lot of discussion around critical digital media literacy, and certainly that's part of Ofcom's strategy for the Online Safety Act. And that's so young people are being taught to think about what you see in an age of mis and disinformation online. And then they're presented with content. We've already spoken about how it is so readily available on the mainstream platforms like TikTok, like YouTube. And it is presented in scientific ways. They draw on evolutionary psychology and biological essentialism. And so it seems credible, and so they're likely to believe these things and feel that they are somehow legitimised as well.
Do you think, you mentioned there the Online Safety Act and Ofcom's role, do you think that they will have the resources and the teeth to deal with this issue? Because quite often, as you say, it operates in this grey area, but also in the pseudoscience. So do you think that Ofcom will actually be able to have the teeth to deal with some of this misinformation and disinformation around gender and women?
I mean, the challenge is recognising misogyny.
Do you think that they will?
Well, misogyny is not illegal. And so obviously having the weight behind them to tackle it and recognise, as I said, those more palatable, less overt forms, I think is incredibly challenging.
Okay, thank you. Jacob had said about selling misogyny. And it is quite clear that there is monetisation of misogyny. How do manosphere influencers make their money? Quite a lot of them talk about crypto. Where's their money coming from and how do they make it? Who's best to answer that one, do you think, best placed? Is it Dr. Lisa or Janaya?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was going to talk about two strands of it. I think one was to reiterate the point earlier around the fact that the platforms themselves, the business model of the platforms is really about the attention economy and trying to create a service which holds the user on for as long as possible, whether that's through amplifying divisive content, which is often harmful and abusive, or if it's about an infinite scroll, or if it's about trying to create a context in where people are engaging and are staying as long as possible, because that connects to a service's sort of ad revenue and user engagement. Then I think alongside that, on an individual level, we can think about the monetization behind it in the sense that people can create kind of entrepreneurial schemes where you pay £7 to get access to a dating advice, or you can have really engaging short-form content on TikTok, but if you want to hear more and if you really want that kind of simple, easy instruction to follow through of how you can, gain success in 6 quick steps or get financial advice or secure the girl that you want, then there's a kind of move on to a paid-for service.
They're making money out of men and young boys' vulnerability and sadness.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, and also from violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's really important to recognise, is that there is a conflict in the sense that there is a business model which profits from violence against women and girls, and there is a government mission to halve violence against women and girls, and at times they're going to be at odds. I think the other point, just building on what Lisa had said, was around the way in which, to think about the influencers potentially with less reach, is that some of the advice, it's not that you would click on a video which says how to rape a woman, for example, or something which is headline grabbing, although that's also the case. It's that it will be presented in a way which is kind of folded into everyday aspirational material. So fitness advice, dating advice, how to make money advice, and then through the course of that is kind of seeds of really harmful attitudes towards women and girls.
Jacob, did you want to add anything on this? But I did want to ask a question. How do we stop that monetisation? Because if you are profiting from content that promotes violence against women and girls, that is illegal and it is harmful. So how do we do that? And
If I may just continue for 1 second on that algorithmic piece, because I think that is really important. We've heard about the attention economy here, but it's not just a case that people will be sort of trapped with a certain set of influences, but actually that they will be served more and more egregious and more misogynistic content over time. So essentially an algorithmic rabbit hole which can facilitate radicalisation. So we conducted a study.
Sorry, Jacob, we are going to come on to algorithms a bit later, if that's okay. I just wanted to stick with the money on this section.
Monetisation. Okay. So there's I think sort of a few different buckets. So as we've heard, there's products. I would put this broadly under a sort of grift bucket. I think that will be challenging, and it will have to be examined on a case by case basis. The extent to which that there is sort of a route through criminal justice means to gather money. There is also donations. So donations through platforms such as Patreon. You can say, if you like my work, go on, send me £5 and you'll keep getting more content. There is also the ad revenue side of things, which I don't think has been hit upon so much, and that is a part, but I would say not the full component. There are these other brackets. So there could be mechanisms to engage with social media platforms around ad revenue, potentially using Ofcom and using the Ofcom Safety Act. But even if ad revenue is shut down, I think it's going to be challenging to go after the sort of broader grift-based economy, which we see propping up a lot of these people.
Can I just add to that, please? Yes. Thank you. I mean, maybe there's something for trading standards as well, because they are branding themselves. So they're selling merchandise. as well. There's clothing, there's men's grooming products with their names on it. They're self-publishing books as well to further promote their ideas and add that veneer of respectability as well, which of course is just monetizing misogyny. So whether or not there's something there that can be sort of drawn on to obviously prevent those projects being out on the market.
Is there any foreign money involved in this, and if so, where from?
Well, I'm not going to talk about state actors, but I would say that when we think about the manosphere writ large, we're dealing with an international network, right? It's not just something which is isolated to the UK.
No.
And so there will be a lot of flows coming from audiences in Germany, audiences in Poland. We've conducted analysis globally which points towards the interconnected nature of these networks. So there will be money flowing across borders, potentially for the purchasing of products, for the sort of donation model as well.
Is the donation model in traditional money formats, or is it in different ways?
As far as I'm aware, it can in different ways. Again, I think it depends, because we're talking about such a spectrum of content, and some which are, I think, more deliberately on smaller sites, and sites which have less oversight or are now subject to less regulation, where I think there's more, I guess, calculation in terms of how are we evading detection and how are we making sure that we're not identified by authorities, versus, as you said, your kind of everyday interaction with mainstream sites and then where that pulls you to. I think I just wanted to, before we move, to go back to that question around the grey area and some of the questions you'd asked about Ofcom and the Online Safety Act. I think the real challenge we see with the Online Safety Act in terms of regulation is that there is a tendency to address sort of forms of violence against women and girls in a very isolated and individual way. So to think about particular priority illegal offences, a form of stalking or harassment or violence, and what are the requirements on different platforms to mitigate those harms. But I think what we're failing to see is sort of the Act and Ofcom themselves looking at this in a systemic way. So what are the different ways in which the broader algorithmic systems or the kind of design and business models or platforms themselves are producing these problems, rather than this being about individual users only, and a lot of the action being geared towards action after the harm is done, so content moderation or getting posts down. But that, again, we're pulling ourselves towards the sharp end of the crisis, and we want to be back to how do we prevent this from happening in the first instance.
Thank you. Alex.
Thank you. This is fascinating. Can I start by asking you, Jacob, to what extent are current moderation policies on social media platforms effective in preventing this content from spreading?
I think there we need to talk about the spectrum of content as we've just heard. In some cases, we have seen particular high-profile influencers being deplatformed. So Andrew Tate being the obvious example there. I think there is a question around whether or not deplatforming did much to limit his audience or his notoriety. I think the fact that this content is still readily accessible, not just on fringe forums and fringe platforms, but on major and mainstream social media platforms, points towards the fact that there is more to be done here. But again, we bring ourselves back to this discussion of grey area content. We're coming from a model where platforms were essentially trusted to go out and moderate themselves, and we would typically have expected them 10 years ago to have a higher threshold than what is explicitly illegal. They wanted to make sure that their spaces were safe, were enjoyable to audiences, and we have seen a backsliding of that. In many ways, this has become a geopolitical football now, right? We're seeing greater pressure, particularly from the current administration in the United States, to roll back on that moderation in protection of their particular conception of freedom of speech. And I think that this is really where the crux is, because as we've seen in the case of X, formerly Twitter, it's very easy to undo moderation efforts and then to suddenly turn your platform into a toxic mess almost overnight. And so this is why I think it's really important to ground these discussions around platform moderation efforts in the broader discussion around regulation in the UK as well. I think I'm not sure if we're going to have further discussion around that, so I can hold off on some of my thoughts around Ofcom, but I think maybe
Yeah,
building into the
I think
chapter
I
as
might.
well.
Is it okay to build on that? I think it's important to note that not only is there little incentive for social media companies to take down harmful content, but there's actually financial incentive for them to keep it up. Right? So I'm sure we all know this, but just to be clear, the financial model of social media platforms is based on advertising revenue. So the public don't pay for these services, and arguably the public aren't the consumers here. Right? The public are the product, or rather their time and attention is the product which is being sold to advertisers. So in my research, we call this process the attention economy, or what Nick Cernick refers to as the algorithmic economy. And what my team at UCL, including Dr. Catherine Smales and Dr. Kaitlyn Shaughnessy, has looked at is the way in which through that attention or algorithmic economy, hate, harm, and disinformation is prioritized. Because disinformation is often more attention-grabbing than truth, and harm, or things that hook into our insecurities or initiate an emotive response, is more attention-grabbing. And that's what advertisers are paying for. And what I'd really like to impress today is that this algorithmic economy is an unethical financial structure which prioritizes profit over people's well-being, and it's through this structure where harm, including online misogyny, flourishes. So in our 2024 Safer Scrolling report, which was done in partnership with the Association of School and College Leaders, we looked at how recommender systems on TikTok actively amplify and direct harmful content to young people. This research employed an algorithmic study using archetype modeling. So we did long-form interviews with young people. We created TikTok profiles based off those young people. And then we analyzed and mapped 1,000 videos which were recommended to our archetypes. And after only 5 days on TikTok, our research showed a 4-fold increase in the level of misogynistic content being presented to our hypothetical young people. This same methodology has been applied by other researchers to other issues. Amnesty International did a project on self-harm using this methodology. Regehr did a project on alt-right using this methodology, all of which point to the same phenomenon. Harm is being algorithmically offered and actually flourishes through this economy.
Thank you. It's devastating, but very interesting.
Can I add to that?
Very quickly, and then I'll need to move on. Yeah.
I think it's important to know how these misogynistic influences are circumventing the control measures that are in place as well. So, for example, in TikTok, research that was undertaken with my colleague Anders Lear at the University of Portsmouth, we were investigating incel content, essentially. And this was apparently after TikTok had banned all incel and misogynistic content in 2022. Now, they had stopped any account that had incel in the profile, but not incels plural. Which is unhelpful as a start. But then also in terms of how other accounts are able to kind of get around those measures, I mean, it's just about using the creative language where they'll omit letters for symbols, they'll refer to terms that are not recognised by platforms, so, you know, the particular language that these groups use as well often go unnoticed and are not moderated. They blur images to avoid the sort of shadow banning, and they copy posts from the more clandestine sites like 4chan and Reddit, and even have links on there which are not being taken down by TikTok, which then obviously direct users to the more extreme sorts of content as well. So just because the platforms are saying we don't allow this content, in practice we can see how they are still allowing it, and in fact they are enabling users to obviously engage with more offensive types of materials as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So would you say then that it's not just difficult to ban content from influencers given the sharing nature and the cross-platform nature of how this works, but it's impossible to do it?
It's not impossible. It's about staying on top of it. I mean, it's difficult because it's such a dynamic space, but it's about understanding these approaches. And I mentioned the language. I mean, anybody that has a little bit of knowledge about, say, the terminology that these groups use would recognise straight away accounts and profiles and posts that are relevant to incels, for example. So it's about obviously having that information and acting upon it.
It's intention followed by resource, essentially. Fabulous, thank you. Janaya, if I could come to you, is demonetisation effective, do you think, or does misogynistic content need to be removed altogether?
I think when it comes to this question of whether content needs to be removed altogether, I think from one perspective, I think the real emphasis for us and lots of our members when it comes to content takedown is particularly the importance of this when it relates to non-consensual intimate images. That's, I know, something that's been raised by the Women Equalities Committee, which is what we really, really welcome, because particularly for survivors who've had their images shared, that's a real challenge in terms of just the re-traumatisation that comes through the inability to have the content removed, but also just this uncertainty about how far the reach is being spread. I know that there's there's sort of evidence around the revenge porn helpline, and that they're able to remove 90%, but there's 10% that they really struggle with. So I think there's some important steps there that the government should be taking, noting that they've sort of rejected a lots of recommendations of the committee, which we hope there is some movement on. So I think content takedown, primarily in relation to non-consensual intimate image abuse, is really important. Outside of that, I think we're always trying to return the conversation to, yes, content takedown is important, but we need to be moving towards preventing the proliferation of it in the first instance. We really want to be returning to safety by design. What are the ways in which platforms and products are designed, we can embed a preventative approach so that these things don't flourish? Because I think once we talk about content takedown, in many ways we're too late, and we're not achieving the goals that we set out to do. So yeah, I think that, I guess there's a bit of both there depending on what the focus is. But I think victims and survivors, that the recommendations that the committee have made around non-consensual intimate imagery, so I think are incredibly important.
Thank you. Lisa, just coming back to you very, very quickly. If a content creator is demonetised, can that content creator and the platform continue to earn money directly or indirectly from that content?
Well, I mean, as we've seen with Andrew Tate, that he personally had his profiles removed, but others kept using his materials and splicing them, obviously cutting them up and things, which still made money for those platforms. So, in evidence, yes. Yes,
yeah. And then, Jacob, coming back to you very briefly, you mentioned about deplatforming, and we've just touched on that. Does it work? Does it pose a risk? Actually, on the other hand, do they move to platforms with less moderation or to mainstream television? Like, does it work, or is it counterproductive?
I think it depends on your objective in the deplatforming. I think in the short term, deplatforming a high-profile influencer on one of the major spaces, so live streaming services, YouTube, TikTok, can have an immediate impact on their ability to reach into sort of particularly vulnerable communities. Although, as we've seen with Andrew Tate, it can also add to their notoriety. I think the thing is we're dealing with a vast universe of platforms now, some which specifically is set up to have very limited moderation efforts. And you will see, and we see this time and time again, not just in the case of misogynistic influencers, but within other extremist movements, that they will always find a way to reach an audience. The audience might be smaller, or the audience might be fragmented, but taking someone down cannot be the whole solution. And I think this sort of comes back to the points around content as well. I don't think that these broader systemic issues are things which we can solely moderate out. And I'll return to a refrain which I've heard from across the panel today, is actually we need to be shifting towards a regulatory system which focuses on safety by design, ensuring that these platforms are actually set up with the safety of their users at the forefront, that they're business models themselves aren't facilitating radicalisation. So, I mean, to give you a one-sentence answer, yes, it can have some impact, but it can't be the whole solution by any means.
Thank you very much. Alex. Quickly to Catherine and then to Emily.
Yeah, just a quick thought then. So we're saying that there's no incentive social media companies to take the content down. So are you basically saying is the only way to get rid of this content is to make misogynistic content illegal, rather like like we have with child sexual abuse imagery? It comes down, there's a system for it to come down. So how do we need to make it illegal, misogynistic content?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the answer would be to make it illegal, because I think that goes back to the way in which we have the Online Safety Act is that it is primarily through the lens of individual criminal offences, and that is the minimum. That's the kind of baseline for action from the social media platforms. If something constitutes a criminal offence, and particularly if it's deemed priority illegal content, then you take action. I think what we're trying to draw attention to is that so much of what underpins violence against women and girls is within the grey areas, and that's where we're looking at things like the recommender systems and the algorithm, professors have talked about in a way that the algorithm promotes those. So how do we get to regulating the social media platforms in a way which addresses the way in which the business models themselves are harmful and which proliferate these things, rather than relying solely on the criminal law, but which I think it comes in far too late.
Yeah,
I just think what Catherine's point is here is I sat on the bill committee that undid all of the work that was done on legal but harmful content on the Online Safety Bill Committee for my sins. Yeah. And I'm just wondering whether actually there's space, because it is this grey area and it is how do you act, and we know that online platforms won't act if it is legal. The conversations that we've all heard, the evidence that we've all heard on non-consensual intimate image abuse, for example, they won't act unless it is illegal. Would it be of benefit to include misogynistic material as illegal or not? If it's not, just let us know. Dr. Kaitlyn.
Okay. So the problem that you will face with that, of course, is the free speech argument, as you know. That predictive technologies, which is what you would be using, would be too restrictive on the rights of the poster, and that we, particularly with misogyny, have this gray area on where we draw the lines around that content. So I don't think the argument should be around free speech. The argument at stake is not about publication, but actually dissemination. So it's not about whether an individual has the right to post this content, but whether social media companies should be actively promoting the content, particularly to young people.
Okay.
Right? So what we want to, I personally think what we should be doing with this is having a rating system on content. And if social media companies are found culpable of actively promoting content on the For You pages, let's say on TikTok, of young people, they should be culpable for this.
Okay.
And we can do this with other things. So I think the focus really needs to be, there's this idea that we're living in a digital town square where everyone has the right to free speech. We don't live in a digital town square. We don't see all content that's posted. We see a very, very narrow picture, which is selected for us personally. And what we need to attack is the way in which we've allowed social media companies to choose what that is for us and choose what that is for our children.
Thank you.
That's the culpability.
Thank you. Emily.
Yeah, I wanted to go on and talk a little bit more about algorithms.
Yeah.
I think that first, I think we've talked a bit about sort of what algorithms are and what they're currently doing. Safety by design is part of the Online Safety Act. Yet, how do you monitor safety by design if there's a lack of transparency in the actual algorithms by the social media companies? And what is the solution to that?
I'd say for violence against women and girls specifically, I guess in the way that correct me if I'm wrong, the way that the legislation is drafted is that there is a role for transparency reporting. So that should allow us to shed some light on the practices of the businesses themselves. I think there's a huge gap for us when it comes to violence against women and girls specifically, and that we have statutory guidance for violence against women and girls, which is currently in draft and in consultation provided by the regulator, but it's voluntary. And I think this is a real contradiction, because so much of the basis for the introduction of the Online Safety Act was a real cross-party consensus understanding that the era of self-regulation was over. This wasn't effective. This was doing untold harm to society. But it comes to the issue of violence against women and girls, we have guidance which is voluntary. We were working as End Violence Against Women Coalition, we were working with a coalition of NSPCC and Professor Claire McGlynn and others around calling for a Violence Against Women and Girls Code of Practice, which was therefore binding, which social media platforms would have to, under the law, comply with its content or explain how they were going to alternatively meet those same standards. So I think that there's a real quite obvious solution there in terms of how do we, under a new government with a halving violence against women and girls mission, make that statutory guidance more robust in the form of a code of practice.
Thank you. Dr. Regehr, I saw you react to that question. Did you want to contribute?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So, a proactive or safety by design approach, of course, would do more to hold tech companies accountable and account for their algorithmic systems as a business model. Let's just pull that apart and think about what that means. So we accept that tech companies know what trainers will want next season, right? We accept that they will know we're pregnant before anyone else does.
Yep.
But do we accept that they will know that our children are self-harming or suicidal without any duty of care? Do we accept this? Probably not. And yet, there is no duty of care, there is no consistent line of communication between tech and government to protect kids. So we accept the Online Safety Act as a cleanup job afterwards. But there is not a consistent mechanism for platforms to report or flag young people consuming harm who are at risk. That is a failure.
Right. Okay, I just want to move it a little bit on to not just the algorithms themselves, but the use of AI, both in content moderation and within informing the algorithms. We are aware currently they are very good at identifying women's health advice and taking it down, having used certain terms. I guess, really to Jacob, do you think they could, what role do you think they do in promoting or moderating misogyny, or do you think they should be doing more, or do you think this is an area where the companies haven't actively thought in terms of programming the AI?
I think there is, at the moment, a bit of a gold rush to try and outsource everything to AI here, and there are a lot of challenges inherent to the training of recommender systems, right? So we know from a number of cases, looking at other related phenomena, so racism, for example, that bias can be introduced into those systems. Accordingly, I think relying solely on AI is always going to cause a number of significant challenges. So we've conducted some research recently in the German context looking at this, where we were analysing TikTok content. We were specifically interested in seeing how discussion of sexual violence against women was moderated, in particular whether or not there was content promoting rape and sexual assault. Well, actually, we found that there was fairly limited content because the AI seemed to be doing a fairly good job at removing that. But what we also found was that the AI was over-moderating against survivor stories to the extent to which that actually the sort of the value there being of social media to provide people with a platform to talk about these difficult issues was being over-moderated. I think that's a roundabout way of saying that there's inherent risk of relying too much on AI for these solutions, that they can actually sort of help create environments which in some ways feel less safe as well.
Fantastic. So the social media company platforms are still hosting the content, promoting misogyny. As you said, there's always a difficult legal line around what is freedom of speech versus what is illegal in terms of incitement or promotion of activity. Why are they still getting away with it? And what should be, or in your view, we'll start with Dr. Lisa, the government's role in that?
I mean, they're going to continue getting away with it if we don't disrupt their business model, as I think we've just continually said. I mean, there's got to be that disincentive for them to continue engaging the way they are. And I know there's obviously in the Online Safety Act, it's about that they could be sued effectively for a year's profits, but to the massive platforms, that's not necessarily going to be much of a concern for them if it even gets to that point. So I mean, I think they really, I mean, I'm loath to kind of say the banning, but I just think there has to be more to be able to disrupt that.
And do you think algorithms are doing enough to disrupt some of the kind of activity that we see as some of the harassment within the manosphere? So the pylons, the doxing and others, where I did a tweet about, on behalf of the victims of Andrew Tate in the UK, about calling for their extradition back into the UK to answer to the allegations that had made by women that I've met. He responded personally, and then a huge pylon happened, including, from what I could tell, many bots were being used to. Do you think algorithms are doing enough to challenge that kind of behaviour where they see the activity all of a sudden landing on individuals? And we know that this is the type of activity, I'm using my example because I don't want to bring out other ones, but we know, I can tell you from some of the stories of the victims of the Tate brothers, that this is activity that drove them off social media platforms. So Jacob, maybe do you want to talk about the tech? They could do that, could they, or not? Could they?
Well, yes, in theory, platforms have a wealth of tools available to them, right? You can delimit content, you can ensure that it reaches fewer audiences, you can label content which is being flagged as potentially harmful. But this comes back to the point which we constantly iterate, that I don't think it's in the interest of these platforms' business models, right? They're in many ways now functioning as outrage machines. They're set up to garner as much attention, garner eyes on screens as much as possible. And we know that highly emotive content is the most effective mechanism for keeping someone's eyes glued to the screen and someone engaging with it. So to answer your question, yes, there are a lot of mechanisms which can happen, but we're not seeing that now. And I think this is consistently evidence through, as you say, the sort of digital pylons, the coordinated harassment campaigns, the coordinated trolling, which has become a persistent feature of manosphere activity online over the past decade.
Yeah, a slightly different point. I just wanted to pick up on what you'd referred to in your question around free speech, because I think this is a really important aspect of this discussion, is I think that when we're talking about how to address online violence against women and girls, there's a tendency for those who are opposed to it to talk about this as an infringement on free speech. But we're very clear that violence against women and girls is an infringement on women's human rights and women's, if we're thinking about the articles, in terms of right to expression, right to life, right to privacy, all of these things are held up in the extent to which we take enough action to end violence against women and girls. So I think it's important we don't see it as a zero-sum game, as in if there is action we take to prevent online violence against women and girls, that is anti-free speech and vice versa. I think these things are really interconnected. There are so many parallels that are made between the online and the offline world in terms of, the inaction and our failure to address this at scale means that women are already changing our behaviour and censoring ourselves online in response to the real risk of violence or threats of violence or previous experiences of violence. So I think it's just really important to enter that into this discussion, that those two things are connected rather than in opposition to one another.
Thank you.
I think just if we're talking about freedom of speech, it's really important to underline these points that I don't think social media platforms are free speech environments.
Yeah, I agree.
They are curated speech environments. They're not a level playing field where anyone can go out and have an equal voice. The voices are being carefully tailored to nudge people towards content which keeps eyes on screens.
Can I just
Thank
add
you,
to that
Emily.
though as well? I'm saying, but it's those that are already privileged that are prioritised as well. I think we need to emphasise that.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. David.
Thank you. Jacob, coming to you. I just want to explore the area of online gaming. So it's something that perhaps people wouldn't generally think about in relation to this area, but can you give us an overview of how online gaming and gaming adjacent social media platforms contribute to the spread of the manosphere?
Yeah, certainly. And I think more broadly, when we talk about these movements, the manosphere or other extremist movements, it's important to understand that they are multi-platform phenomena. They spread across a vast universe and ecosystem of social media platforms. Now, gaming itself, I think, forms an essential part both in the evolution of the manosphere and as an environment which continues to incubate toxic and misogynistic worldviews. So over a decade ago, there was the Gamergate phenomenon. It was essentially a large-scale harassment campaign leveraged by gamers operating across a range of fringe platforms, which have already been noticed, 4chan, also Reddit, for example, who sought to go out and harass and attack high-profile women involved in games media and games production, who they saw as essentially responsible for in their term, feminization of gaming spaces or the injection of woke ideology into their gaming spaces. Now, this had a significant impact on the people who were on the receiving end of this harassment, but it also, I think, formed a bit of a test case for some of the patterns of behavior which we see playing out in extremist movements now. So the so-called alt-right in the US, I would say, was incubated by Gamergate communities. It's there where they learned and honed their skills in silencing voices online through targeted harassment. Similarly, it formed, I think, a very visible, very tangible manifestation of manosphere ideology. So if we look at the history, gaming platforms have really helped shape the movement writ large. But there is a broader issue with gaming platforms, and that's to do with just the normalization of social norms which are toxic. Yeah. So there's wealth of research which points towards this. So research out of the University of California suggests that 85% of participants in their analysis encounter hate speech online, with misogyny being the most prevalent form of hate speech. Similar research has been conducted by Amar Amarasingham, which again pointed towards around 80% of gamers experiencing hate speech, with misogyny being virulent. The ADL in the US have done repeated surveys which point towards around half of women gamers experiencing harassment on a regular basis. So on the one hand, you have these cultures which have helped drive the manosphere, helped these communities test their tactics for online harassment, but on the other hand, you just have a broader set of social norms which allow this misogyny to sort of be maintained and to grow in a relatively unchecked fashion. And I see nodding from across the panel, so I'm not sure if other panelists want to jump in there.
Just on the point you just made then about unchecked, is it fair to say that the level of controls around this sort of behaviour on gaming platforms is probably less so than the limited level of controls we see on other platforms?
I think it's fair to say that gaming platforms and gaming companies have been largely absent from conversations around online safety. I think perhaps because when we started these conversations, the most visible form of activity was on your Twitters, your Facebooks, your YouTubes. Gaming platforms probably just kept their head down and hoped that they weren't going to have attention drawn to them. And you see similarly a lack of engagement on an ongoing basis around online safety. This again comes back to the nature of the content in question, though. So we know that gaming platforms invest very heavily to counter grooming of children by sexual predators, because young people are such a large market of them. What we have seen less evidence of is them investing in similar moderation around hate speech. But then the challenge here is you're not dealing with one very large company like TikTok or Facebook, but a number of different distribution platforms. So again, I think the focus becomes dissipated somewhat.
Lisa, you seem to be nodding quite heavily there. Did you want to add?
So when it comes to video games, I think there's an agreed consensus that it's the representations within that sphere is problematic. It's well renowned for being sexist and misogynistic and discriminatory, hence that female gamers often disguise the fact that they are women. I think for excellent work around gender and gaming, I would recommend Dr. Fraser Heritage from Manchester Metropolitan University, and he and I recently wrote a paper as well for the conversation, focusing more specifically on incels and gaming and the sort of pipeline through there. I do think we need to be cautious, though, because engagement with video games, along like any other media, does not always mean that automatically someone's going to be radicalised into sort of misogynistic ideologies. But certainly in the research that I did with incels, they did mention that spending those long periods in these isolated spaces where these ideas are percolating, where the sort of really negative comments about women and female relatives are just commonplace. That did sort of lead them to identify with being an incel when they were then exposed to then the particular incel content. It kind of sort of ticked a checkbox for them as well. So I think recognising that the problematic representations that are so easily available and accessible within video games can create that baseline from which those more like extreme manosphere ideologies can resonate, and so it could become an entry point as well.
Thank you. If I can just come to you now, Janaya. Looking at pornography, so what impact does access to violent and extreme pornography have on attitudes towards women and girls, do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, and I think it would be quite remiss to talk about the manosphere and the online world without addressing the role of pornography. Obviously, we know that pornography is not only one thing, but we know that within pornography, the prevalence of violent forms of it it's incredibly prevalent. I think historically there have been lots of debates about the extent to which you can prove cause and effect between engaging with pornography and violent acts. I think we've evolved since then in that we tend to, lots of the academics in this area, such as Fiona Vera-Gray, Professor Claire McGlynn, tend to talk about this in the sense of which, to what extent does violent pornography create some of the social scripts for young people and society more broadly, seeing pornography as one part of the kind of cultural wallpaper of the society. The research, I think it was done by Claire McGlynn and Vera Gray, found that when looking at landing pages of the largest 3 porn websites in the UK, 1 in 8 titles described sexually violent acts. And I think this is really important to factor in, because particularly when we're talking about content moderation and what's on and what's off, or what's happening in schools and whether sexual violence is taken seriously, for example, I think there's a real contradiction there if we are addressing the harm only after it's occurred, but if in young people's lives they're regularly engaging with material which is depicting women in ways in which they are dominated by men, when they're routinely sort of deliberately humiliated by men, where they are seen as not only kind of objectified but subjugated, then that's going to have an impact on people's worldview. views across age groups. So I think this is something that would really welcome the Women Equalities Committee kind of exploring further, because it's such a huge field. And I think there's also a connection here with the proliferation of non-consensual intimate image abuse and the extent to which that features on pornography websites. In our view, the Online Safety Act wasn't set up to regulate pornography. That wasn't one of its kind of principal routes. A lot of the discussion was around children's access to pornography, which is really important. But I think there's a case to be made around, even outside of categories of extreme pornography, what are the roles, for example, of search engines? So the fact that you can, as academics have spoken about to previous committees, the fact that you can access these sort of extreme forms of pornography and violent pornography via your mainstream search engine is a problem, and that's going to have to be considered, I think, much more intently than it has been to date.
Thank you. I think Dr. Regehr, just briefly, if you can just add to that.
I just wanted to note how also consumption of pornography feeds into other offline behaviours and other types of digital behaviours for young people. So my work with Jessica Ringrose, which looked at 500 young people, found that the rates of digital flashing, so that's the unsolicited sending of sexual images, particularly to girls, was incredibly high. So 75% of the girls in our focus groups had experienced it by the age of 15. That research informed the new cyber flashing legislation. So it's now illegal for an adult to send a picture of their genitals to a child. But these laws, of course, are focused on the individual perpetrator rather than the platform that allowed the harm to circulate. And as my colleague Amir Malik, who now advises the UN on AI strategy, rightly pointed out to me, criminalizing the individuals is one thing, criminalizing the platform that allowed the image to circulate is another. So that is to say there's still no threat to these businesses' bottom lines or threat to legal repercussions to the tech companies that facilitate the image being sent to a minor. So that's just one example, but I think it highlights how we need a much more holistic approach. That is, rather than putting out individual fires, we should be going to the source, the fuel that ignites them. And to do that, I think we need a three-pronged approach, which is regulation, moderation, and education.
On that point, which social media platforms would you recommend are most prolific at this?
In image-based abuse?
Yeah.
So that particular study with Jessica Ringrose was specifically mostly on Snapchat. There was also, it's an incredibly culpable platform that way. In terms of, there's also a lot of problems with Instagram, and that's also a space where we see porn push happening for young men. So not that young men are necessarily actively seeking pornography, but they are being pushed it through private messengers on Instagram.
Okay, so Instagram and Snapchat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Rachel.
Thank you, and thank you for bearing with us through what seems like a long process, particularly when we can hear people having fun outside. It's always more difficult.
More fun in here.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on to looking at education. So Kaitlyn first, if I may. What education do you think should be included in the national curriculum to help the influence of help prevent the influence of the manosphere on young men and boys?
Okay, so let me first talk a little bit about moderation, because I know that's a big debate at the moment. So there's a lot of attention that's been focused on the regulation of devices, i.e. smartphones, right? And I think we do, all of us, indeed need to be moderating or banning some forms of usage. We all do. But equally, this is not necessarily a device-specific issue. It spans phones, tablets, and internet-connected screens. Further, from a platform perspective, other countries that have banned social media, such as Australia, have not included YouTube in this ban, which shares much of the same content as other social media platforms. And in this country, Ofcom figures from 2024 suggest that 80% of kids from the age of 3 to 17 utilize YouTube. So we need to be looking much more holistically across devices and platforms, much more broadly in the way we draw these boundaries about what counts as social media engagement if we're going to look at moderation. As for education, my team and I advocate for an investment in critical algorithmic literacy to be implemented across the curriculum, ensuring interventions are up to date and technological advancements, and allowing students to be co-creators of their safe practice. So we have a set of resources that will be distributed nationally with the School Association of School and College Leaders next week. It's also essential to include boys in these discussions. It's really hard to tell boys all the things they can't be without giving them options about what they can. So a peer-to-peer learning approach, which has been exemplified by Education Scotland's Mentors in Violence Prevention, is an excellent model, which they've rolled out in half the schools in Scotland. And with my colleague Nicola Shaughnessy, we've worked with this group to develop their materials about online misogyny. And here, it's amazing, older boys mentor younger boys about digital misogyny, championing youth voice, promoting positive role modeling. And this is an educative rather than a punitive response to boys' behavior. And they love it. They have hoodies that say, I'm a mentor. And it's completely changed the ecosystems of this school. I talked to one school leader of a comp in Liverpool who had used those resources from Scotland, and he said it's the best thing he's ever done in his school.
Interesting. Could I ask you, Janaya, how can we reach men, though, who are no longer in education, particularly young men?
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I guess this is something to add just to the conversation that we've been having today, is that there's a necessary focus on young people's attitudes. You know, there's emerging research about the extent, or the questions around the extent to which young people's views are becoming more regressive and more troubling. Even in EVAW's own polling between 2018 and 2025, we're finding that there's almost been a flip over. So some of the research we did before around sexual attitudes, it was the older age groups who tended to espouse more sort of rape myths and stereotypes. But in the research that was carried out by the Crown Prosecution Service and Equalities, they actually found that it was the younger cohort, so those who are aged 18 to 24, who held some of the most troubling views around rape myths and stereotypes. But while saying all of that, I think it's really important to bring into the picture that this isn't only a problem for young people, this is across society, and that it can't be that only young people are agents of social change, particularly if within the media, within institutions, including the police and the military and all of these things, there are all of these revelations about the extent to which this is a problem across older age cohorts. In terms of what we can do there, we are big advocates for more investment in sort of public health campaigns, so including behaviour change campaigns. This was something that was initiated to some extent under the last government with things like the Home Office's Enough campaign or the Mayors Have a Word campaign. We know that there were some evaluations done there with some really valuable finding, but this is something that we'd like to see on a sort of multi-year sustained basis in which there's real long-term investment, because as everyone here will know, this kind of change in social attitudes, behaviours, it's not something that happens often in 6 months or a year, and particularly when we're up against such countervailing forces of the online world and the manosphere. So I think really giving a nod to the public behaviour campaigns there. Again, also going back to the conversation we've just had around pornography and access to pornography, Baroness Burton carried out a pornography review which has a set of 32 recommendations which this government is able to take forward if so willing. So I think that's also another really important route. And then I think there's just something about when we're thinking about the Halving Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, really wanting to see that shift so that it's something that is held by every government department. So not long after the election, EVAW, we published something called an accountability mechanism, which was really looking at how can we ensure that every government department is responsible and is held accountable for the measures that it's taking. So what is the MHCLG doing? What's happening in social security and welfare? How might that be contributing to conducive context for folk? So it's trying to also looking at it at a systems level, but also across all age cohorts.
Jacob, have you got anything to add in terms of how you think we can be reaching men and educating them?
So I think just maybe one more thing to add on this is actually thinking about part of this as part of broader strategies around protecting men and boys' health as well. Mm-hmm. So Movember recently put out some research which pointed towards the fact that men who engaged with masculine influencer content online actually had poorer mental health outcomes. Mm-hmm. And I think this is really important for us to consider, that actually engaging in this material, engaging with the very specific branding of masculinity which is promoted by these influencers, has a degraded and negative impact on well-being. Now, there are broader strategies, and I believe there's currently a consultation ongoing around men's and boys' health. And I think that when we're looking at the strategies which are in place around safeguarding men's mental health, we should be considering the negative impact which this particular brand of toxic masculinity is having there, and finding ways that those strategies are conversant around it.
Thank you. I think you've already sort of touched on your peer-to-peer mentoring programme, so I'll move on in the interest of moving things forward.
I can't recommend it enough. I really
can't. Thank you. So this one to Lisa. At what point do you think you would consider that someone has been radicalised by manosphere content, and how can they be de-radicalised?
Okay, that's a really difficult question. I mean, as I said, it's not just a simple process of you watch this content and automatically you believe in it. There's obviously other individual and external factors that might make people more susceptible to that. And then when they start engaging with it and posting their own, like, maybe hateful things, how they're then viewing women and how they're speaking to the women in their lives. There's obviously maybe red flags, but I suppose it's difficult because it's probably an individual process as well. I'd hate to kind of just say that there's a sort of one-size-fits-all approach to this, because it's really difficult.
It's almost so to help us, so that we can be saying, well, what are those red flags particularly? What red flags are there along that route, and then how can we sort of turn somebody back?
I mean, obviously, clearly expressing some of this hateful content is an obvious red flag. Yeah. But then, I mean, some of the arguments that certainly come up in my research is that it's cathartic. Oh, this is just fantasy. I don't necessarily believe it. But of course, it's still normalising and validating that, and the message it sends to would-be perpetrators is that, this is okay for you to do. So I suppose it's really difficult. I think if somebody is contributing to it, then they're part of it, even if they themselves might challenge that. So I think there's that. Sorry, I can't be sort of more specific there.
It's fine. It is a difficult question. I mean, do you think there is anything that people can do to sort of de-radicalise people when they've reached that?
Yeah, so, I mean, we're talking about misogyny here. We're talking about negative attitudes towards gender equality, which is a driver of violence against women and girls. Yeah. And so I think we could look to domestic abuse intervention schemes as well. And I realise that obviously that might seem off-putting, talking about those things are for perpetrators, but it's about deprogramming. It's about giving them that alternative narrative that, oh, actually women are human beings too, and they're worthy of your respect. So when we can look at those, and I know there have been many of these programs that have been successful as well, so whether or not we call them by the same label and risk that defensiveness, which is obviously so pertinent in these spaces, but I think we can certainly look to some of the best practice that it has been demonstrated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. In an education setting, I mean, some of the issues that we've talked about on NCII and others is that, and we've seen that with some of the serious kind of incidents that have taken place by young men and boys, is that it wouldn't have been flagged as a serious enough incident or any of the behaviour beforehand, in the same way it would have been if it was other radicalised kind of content. Is there an argument that, whether it's Prevent or a different form of Prevent, needs to start looking at this? Because, Jacob, at the beginning of this, you talked about that there was a correlation between the misogynistic content of the manosphere and radical far right or even extremist kind of content as well. Is there a need for that?
I think absolutely. And I would say that my understanding is it is recognised up until a certain degree. This goes back to the point I made around, in particular, extremist misogyny itself being recognised as an extremist ideology. Now, this is not relevant to all of the manosphere, but certainly some of the most egregious components of it, particularly those where we see the highest risk for violence. And I would absolutely say that there is space within the Prevent infrastructure, within the channel programme, to identify warning signs, ensure that that knowledge is transferred effectively to frontline practitioners who have a duty of care under Prevent, and also to invest more broadly in intervention providers and intervention practitioners who can do that valuable de-radicalisation work. What I would say, though, is that is just the very, very sharp edge of the tip here, and it needs to be part of a much more broad strategy, which includes the preventative measures which we've heard so much about, which includes public health approaches to countering violence against women and girls. And this is really where I see a need, is in a more joined up strategy, one which recognises the role of counter-terror architecture, one which recognises the role of broader strategies to counter violence against women and girls, and one which recognises the role of education. And I think that connectivity is something which is much needed.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Catherine and then Alex. I'm conscious of the fact that there may be votes soon, so I just wanted to make sure that we get through these last two sections before the vote.
So, Janaya, one for you. To what we have touched briefly on the Online Safety Act. In fact, in several of the answers, not really that briefly. But so, do you, just to be clear, do you think that the Online Safety Act adequately addresses misogynistic content online?
Thank you. I think the short answer is no. No, absolutely not. I think we raised these concerns during the passage of the Online Safety Act in terms of the way in which the bill was drafted. In its initial drafts, violence against women and girls wasn't even mentioned by name. And I think as the discussion has raised, I think there are concerns about the ways in which the approach has been one which is really geared towards a really individualised approach, which it does not consider violence against women and girls within the round and doesn't go far enough to address the business model which promotes this content. And just to reiterate the earlier point, the fact that we have EVAW guidance, which is statutory guidance and which is voluntary, despite the fact that there's widespread recognition that we can't rely on simply the kind of goodwill or self-regulation of some of these platforms, particularly because we know how much of a source of profit violence against women and girls is. I think if I could just add, just because I'm conscious that it's a huge topic, to add to what Jacob said, because I think this is something that the coalition has been considering. I think to say we're much more cautious about the transference of counter-terrorism practices and Prevent to this. I think particularly because when we're thinking about this as an issue which often shows up in schools and with young people, this is our evidence is saying we're looking at this as a human rights issue, as a safeguarding issue, as a welfare issue, and I think even from what we know in terms of the PREVENT programme, obviously there are huge challenges with it, but a lot of the question marks still remain, as even if there are warning signs which are identified, the fact remains of then what support or provision or intervention is provided for young people. So it's not necessarily that applying the PREVENT programme leads us to a case in which a young person who is displaying harmful sexual behaviour or is talking about young girls and women in class in a problematic way, that leads us to some solution where we address it. So I think it's, again, because I think we're in agreement that the question there is about the resource and the investment and the evidence around what works to stop that behaviour escalating, rather than about what the extent to which we put in other sort of practices and surveillance within schools.
I think that's why I said PREVENT type programme, because I think that we can all agree that there are massive failures and flaws within the PREVENT system. But at the moment, when police have spoken about really horrific crimes, actually the behaviour had been flagged, but was not enough because it was misogynistic rather than a prescribed organisation. But it didn't go any further because it did not meet the threshold of PREVENT.
But I'd say to that as well, I wondered to what extent is it around thresholds, but also about resources, of even had it met a threshold for PREVENT, what then package of interventions would be available for a young person?
I completely agree, but the evidence they gave us was that it didn't meet a threshold. Emily?
Can I just... it makes me think a lot about what we're doing around some of the programs around anti-gang, anti-knife violence, and the lack of reoffending or stopping reoffending, and we've got this sort of big brother situation into prisons. We have different programs that have been successful. From what you know about those programs, do you think an approach like that focuses on men and boys having that healthier attitude could be extended into this kind of dealing with some of these attitudes?
Yeah, I don't know if I know enough about those programs to comment, but I think certainly from what you've described, that parallel in terms of thinking about what is most effective for the young men and boys and their lives with it. So what context are they situated in? Who are their role models? What sort of behaviour they're engaging with? Who is it that would be most influential in terms of changing their behaviour, looking at their motivations for getting involved? If you're thinking about gang activity and criminal exploitation, that there's incentives for money. So I think that there's lots of learning, I guess, across different forms of abuse and exploitation, but I think oftentimes the question or the challenge returns to resources in terms of how much investment there has been in early intervention and in some of that behaviour change work.
Thank you very much, Emily. Alex?
Thank you.
Sorry, Alex, before we just need to come back to Catherine.
I did have one more question, which was, I agree, Kaitlyn, with your regulation, moderation, education. I thought that was really powerful. But when I've just been sitting here thinking, how are we going to get any social media company to moderate? And would you say it would be a good idea for us to recommend that we need to try and persuade one social media company to be the first one to take this seriously, to do the work, to start moderating content, and that will then lead others to do so. And if not, we're just never going to do it. Yeah, who go for it?
Just jump in very briefly, because Ofcom have got this draft guidance at the moment, which is open for consultation, which we've heard about, and I think there are challenges there in that it is currently voluntary, right? But I think we do have to see the extent to which that has an impact in and of itself. My suspicions are it won't have a huge one. I think at that point, then, the question needs to be whether or not the guidance which has been issued becomes the first iteration of a future statutory code of practice around violence against women and girls. And I think that would be an appropriate sequencing there. I can share our consultation response with the committee because I know we're pressed for time, but I would again bring this back to the conversation and the refrain which we've had from across the panel here, which is also this really needs to come down to strengthening the recognition of systemic platform harms, platform design and algorithmic harms as well, and lean into some of the measures which are under the OSA there to put that pressure on platforms as well. And I would say that there is more Ofcom can be doing with the tools which they have to be holding these platforms to account.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. You okay? Alex.
Thank you. Very quickly, my first question to Janaya. Does the government need to introduce an offence classifying misogyny or extreme misogynistic speech as a hate crime?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. I know that's something that's been debated over the years. EVAW is a coalition, so within our 160 members, there are different views on this. I think EVAW's tendency is not to steer towards that as a first approach. I think the reason is, I guess, when we're talking about violence against women and girls, we situate this within a broader context of inequality, so gender inequality and structural inequality, violence against women and girls as a cause and consequence of gender inequality. And I think there can be a risk sometimes in only talking to misogyny and hate crime of kind of individualising what is also a structural issue. And also, given what everyone has said today and given the government's ambition in terms of halving violence against women and girls, we're less sure about whether that takes us where we want to go in terms of prevention. So I think that there is questions to be asked about the extent to which, having it as an aggregating factor, what that might mean about reporting, but I think that potentially steers us towards the criminal justice system and some of the solutions that we've been exploring with much more frequency than the prevention that we want to see front and centre.
If I could come in very briefly on that, and I completely agree with what you say in terms of prioritisation of approaches, and actually the broader question here being preventing this mainstreaming of misogyny. But I do think there is potentially a gap in current hate crime legislation as it stands in terms of looking at the way these movements have evolved, in the fact that there is now quite in certain cohorts of manosphere a clear ideology which advocates for violence and crime against women, which is at its core misogynistic rather than anything else. And to me, that motivation of hostility there looks similar to the aggravating factors which we have around race or disability or transgender identity around hate crime. And I do think that there is scope for a discussion around whether or not that is a gap, but I completely agree that criminal justice approach cannot be the only solution which is proffered to this, but just a solution to perhaps a small number of cases.
Thank you. That leads me very nicely to the final question, which is to all of you, really briefly, what other policies or legislation do you think need to be enacted by the government in order to address the harm of the manosphere? If you could pick one thing, what would it be?
I'll go first, just because I'm conscious we're working with some great partners at the moment, Make It Mandatory campaign, Sex Education Forum and Brooke, around looking at where some of the gaps are in relationships and sex education. I spoke a bit earlier about the fact that there's been some great work and lots of work in Parliament to ensure that mandatory RSHE is across England and Wales, but I think there's a real gap in that it's not extended for 16 to 18-year-olds, so particularly those in further education. There's lots of evidence around the fact that this cohort of young people are really open and willing to engage in these conversations, but I think that's quite a simple thing that we could put forward, and we have a Children's and Wellbeing Bill before us, so I have to recommend that.
Beyond my point I've just made around hate crime, I would go back to my point around strategies around men's and boys' health, and particularly mental health, and making sure that they are conversant and communicative with the impact which this sort of toxic masculinity can have on the outcomes for men and boys as well.
So I will go back to my refrain of moderation, education, and regulation. I think we need a three-pronged approach to these issues. From a regulation standpoint, I'll draw from colleagues at the Molly Rose Foundation who suggest that a new or revised act should reassert an overarching duty of care that places the primary onus on tech firms to identify and respond to all harms.
Thank you. Lisa.
Okay, so because the influence of the manosphere it revolves around dominating women, coercive control, and there is obviously the reach towards young people. I think domestic abuse should be recognised for people under 16.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you to the committee and to Emily Darlington for guesting for our committee as well. Thank you And if there is anything that you think I haven't been able to explore this as much as you'd want to, or you think when you leave here we didn't touch on an issue that you think we should have done, please write in to us and we will include that as the evidence as well. Thank you very much. That brings this session to a close. Order, order.